Are you ready to take your business to the next level? Every day there are countless books and articles that are published offering the key on how to make your business a success. It's easy to feel overwhelmed trying to keep up and run your business. That's why Deb Creer created the Business Power Hour. Keep up on the latest trends, best practices, and techniques for how to make your business a success. Let the Business Power Hour do the heavy work for you.
Good morning, good morning. I am Deb Creer, and I am passionate about giving professionals the tools that they need to make themselves and their businesses as successful as possible. And today, as we are hopefully maybe kind of sort of coming out of all of this coronavirus pandemic stuff, we record this program in advance. And so we always have to, we're not quite sure what's happening when this program goes live. But what's going to be fun about this is we are talking with a person about HR and software that is needed and how to hire and all sorts of things, which are some topics that have really come up recently. And so this is going to be so much fun. So please join me in welcoming Phil Strazzulla to our program today. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Great. Well, let me tell people just a little bit about you. So Phil Strazzulla is the founder of Select Software Reviews, a website dedicated to helping HR find and buy the right software through free expert advice. Phil started his career working in venture capital before attending that little school called Harvard, for he went to Harvard Business School for his MBA. Phil is a self-taught programmer who is currently on his second company. So again, Phil, welcome.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
Well, I always ask people, how did you get to where you are today? And how did you decide that for at least right now, this is your passion in life?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I guess you can sort of talk about the immediate step before taking whatever path you're on right now. I always actually think back to like when I was a kid. I started getting interested in the stock market when I was in like fourth grade. Wow. It was, I think like 1995, Netscape had just gone public. The sort of first tech boom had just started and everybody was just sort of talking about the stock market. Like, I'd be playing like basketball in our driveway and like the local parents would be like talking about stocks. And I was like, what is this thing?
Yeah.
And yeah, I just kind of got interested in it. And I think especially because I started realizing that this was probably a much better way to make money than mowing lawns, which was what I was doing at the time, and you spend, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours mowing a lawn and you get like $10.
Right. But if you bought stock, you might get 15.
Yeah, exactly. You didn't really have to do much, right? Like all you needed was money and then that money would like get you more money. It's sort of like that guy on Shark Tank, Mr. Wonderful. And he's like, I've got my like money soldiers or whatever. And they go out and fight these wars and they get more money. And I was sort of intrigued with that concept. And so after like a year and a half, 2 years, my brother and I sort of convinced my parents to let us start trading stocks. And so my mom took us to the local Fidelity branch. We opened up accounts. He's a year younger than me. And we just sort of started like reading Worth magazine for stock tips, investing in the stock market. And we had a pretty good run up and through the 90s. We were sort of smart enough to listen to Warren Buffett and Alan Greenspan in 99, 2000 and got, to cash. So we didn't kind of suffer that downturn. And I sort of fell in love. Like I love finance even today. I still do investing. And at that point, I always thought I wanted to be like a stockbroker or whatever, right? Like I didn't really understand like what the career paths were at that point. But then in college, I interned at a 2-person startup in New York. I was going to NYU for undergrad, studying business, studying finance because that was my interest. Worked for this 2-person company, had a lot of autonomy, a lot of impact, and I just loved that. So I actually kind of changed my trajectory and said, you know what? One day I'd love to start my own business. And I don't really know what that'll look like or how to do that, but I would like to start my own business. And so after college, I took a couple of jobs that I thought would help me kind of build a skill set and a network to eventually do that. most notably working in the venture capital industry, doing early stage software investing. Went to business school, finally had the guts to actually start something. Did the whole teach yourself how to program thing because I thought that was an essential skill to start a business. Started something in the HR space, eventually got it to a point where I hired somebody to become a general manager for that business. And so a year and a half ago, I had a lot of extra time. I still had the startup bug. I think it's, anybody out there who's ever started a business sort of knows it's like this,
Right.
thing.
Yeah. Once you do it, you're like, ooh, have to do it again.
Exactly. Yeah. It's sort of like a drug or something, you're just like driven to it, even though it's so irrational if you think about your other sort of career opportunities. But I wanted to start another business, and I really love to learn. I love to teach. And a gap in the market that I saw is that most HR teams, buying tools and software is a very small part of what they do. So they don't usually get very good at it. There aren't very good online resources for understanding what are the best vendors, how to buy it, et cetera. And so, you know what? I'm going to set out to be sort of that trusted resource to help people, kind of like a consumer reports for HR software. So that's my very long-winded answer to how I got to where I am today.
I love it. And you're one of those dreaded millennials, which, it's so funny. Now, obviously, when I talk to millennials, I'm talking to them on this program. So they are, but I love millennials. They are, for the most part, driven. As you said, you started early with this passion. How many other kids are in 6th grade and are thinking, well, hey, I should buy stock. And I, that's one of the really fun things. And I love talking to millennials because you guys, and I'm not a millennial, I'm far from a millennial. You know what you want and you go and you do it. Our generation talks ourselves out of it. Or we think, oh, that's not practical. We shouldn't do that. We should work for someone else. Or, if we started a business, we need to see it through, all these various things. And so I love talking with millennials, partially because I suppose I'm jealous.
Yeah, I think it's a cool generation. Like we sort of have a little bit of context of like the pre-internet world, but we more or less grew up with technology.
Right.
And so we have, that whole facility. And I think you're right to a large extent. I look at a lot of my friends, my peers, relative to their parents. And I'm actually thinking about this more and more now that we're sort of quarantined. And a lot of folks have like moved to the suburbs, to their parents' houses, because a lot of my friends live in cities and it's just safer and more space. It's a better place to be quarantined. And it's sort of interesting to think about where those parents who, for the most part, are fairly successful were when they were in their mid-30s.
Right.
And I think probably most of my friends are on a more accelerated track. And I think in part that's because the world has shifted and allowed people to take more accelerated tracks in their careers. There's more of a meritocracy in a lot of companies, especially technology businesses. But I think a lot of it too is just seeing the example set by the previous generation and saying, you know what, let's try to do better.
Right. Well, and I think a lot of times what we see is that, you as millennials see a need for something and you think, well, let's do it.
Yeah.
You create your own companies. I see a need and I'm like, okay, who can I get to do that for me? Or, maybe it's not even a need, nobody needed it before. Who cares? You see, you go, what? Hey, we might as well do this. And, and a big part of it is fearless. You're like, okay, we'll do it. If it doesn't work out, doesn't work out. And so, I love that. And as you said, you saw this need for this company. And as I was researching your company, it was interesting because I know this much basically about HR.
Yeah.
Now, and I actually know a little bit more, but not an awful lot more, because as a solopreneur, I don't have employees. Now I do have a virtual assistant. But then when I worked for corporations, somebody else handled that for me. Even if I was hiring for my department, there was still the HR people who did things and all of those things. And so I never really worried about any of this. And so when I was, my first thought was, wait a minute, there's software to do this? I mean, that really was one of my, and then when I looked through your website, which is selectsoftwarereviews.com, there's what, 20 at least categories of software that you review. And so that just totally perplexed me. Because again, I was thinking there's software to do this.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear when you worked for larger companies, the HR team was doing their job and you didn't have to worry too much about it. That's always a good thing. There's software we right now have 20 categories, and probably by the end of the year, we'll have closer to 50. There's software to do every little thing within HR that you could think of. So there's, how do you get in touch with people? Like, how do you reach out to that software engineer, that, future VP of marketing or whatever the case may be? There's probably, 70 or 80 companies that will just help you with that little piece of it. There's then, how do you take in their application? That's this applicant tracking system, which is sort of like one of the core layers. There's, how do you vet that application? So you send somebody a test, and that could be a video interview, which is really big in the days of COVID-19. That's actually exploded. Like, the interest in video interviewing is up like 8 or 9x on our site. Really incredible. So, there's personality assessments, there's technical assessments if you're a programmer or a data scientist. There's onboarding, there's your payroll, there's your benefits, there's employee engagement, there's offboarding, there's you know what I mean? Like, you name it. And there's so many different niches even within that, right? Like, if you want to reach out to just diversity candidates, or whatever the case may be. So it's really complex. And then within each of these categories, you literally have hundreds and hundreds of vendors. So this applicant tracking system thing I just mentioned, there's probably 400 or 500 companies that provide an applicant tracking system. And some of them are really big, like Oracle, and some of them are really small, like some company you've never heard of in Israel. And there's a select few that are actually really good. And then there's a bunch of others that are good at marketing and good at selling. And then there's a lot of really terrible solutions out there as well. So it's a complex landscape. And that's what we spend all day doing, just try to understand, how do we take 400 and make it into a short list, so that somebody who is only spending 5% of their time to get a new ATS because, they're dealing with employee relations issues, outplacements, hiring, whatever, they can focus on all that stuff that they need to get done and still do a really good job on buying the right software.
Right. And you mentioned tracking. I mean, that is huge, because I've always been on the other end of it. The submit your resume and pray type of thing. And I remember when I worked for a big company and I was hiring, I had certain people that I brought through, and I made notes. I mean, I made handwritten notes, and this was not that long ago. I mean, there was probably software I could have been using. But, finally get it down to, okay, I want to make an offer to this person. And I, talk with the HR folks and all of that. But then I remember asking them, well, now what? What about those people that either we didn't even talk to, we just sent the thank you so much for submitting your but more importantly, what about the people that we brought in? And they looked at me and they went, well, that's your responsibility. And and what had happened was, I had one of those people who contacted me and said, I interviewed with you several weeks ago and haven't heard anything. And to me, that was absolutely mortifying, and I didn't care whose responsibility it was, but it needed to be done. When someone is looking for a job, and now of course it's we're going to see things just turn into, all sorts of situations, because there's going to be so many people who are looking for new jobs. When you're in that position of applying for jobs and you don't know what the status is, I mean, one of the first things that we're always told is don't contact them. Well, just the fact that there is software that can track all of that and say, okay, Phil submitted his resume on X date. We talked to him on X date, and I'm sure there's lots more complication in there. Like, one of the things I tell people is, many times your first interview is someone looks you up online. You know, they want to see your LinkedIn profile, all those things. So, okay, so that checkbox is marked off, you know. And so then it goes through all these things, and it gets down to, okay, Phil was not made the offer, but we need to let Phil know, you know, that we know that, or Phil was made the offer, and now what? And, you know, long gone are the days when we should be just, you know, writing it on pieces of paper. And so I love that your company helps with that, because as you mentioned, this is not, it typically, you know, unless you are a really big company, it's not 100% of what you do. It's only a small portion. And so to be able to just use the technology that's out there when you need it is great, without having to go through the 400 different vendors to figure out what you need.
Yeah. And, you know, it's kind of interesting. Like, one of the things that we try to do, in addition to giving you a short list and, you know, what are the questions you should ask on demos and stuff like that, is our best practices
Right.
to help you be successful with the software.
Mm-hmm.
Because what you're describing is what I call like the resume black hole, which is like,
right.
you apply for a job, you never hear back, or maybe you go for an interview and you never hear back, or maybe
Right.
like 7
They
interviews.
cared enough to bring you in and you don't hear anything.
Yeah. And it's an unfortunate sort of like very common trait of humans, where if somebody wants something from you and you've got lots of people that want something from you, you sort of like start to dehumanize those people.
Right.
And anybody who has worked in sales has felt this, where, you know, if you work in sales, like, people don't show up for your sales calls, and they don't give you heads up. They basically treat you like less than a person.
Right.
And I think we have historically done that to people seeking jobs as well. The last 10-year bull market has changed that a little bit, because unemployment was so low. And so we saw more companies.
Yeah, the applicants kind of had the upper hand.
They did, especially, you know, if you knew how to program, or you knew how to sell, or, you know, you had some sort of skill set or interesting degree or whatever, you really were in control. And obviously that's going to shift now. But it's really unfortunate. And, you know, there's economic reasons to be good to people. Virgin actually did this whole study where they found that of the people who applied for jobs at their company, something like 18% said they would never be a customer of Virgin again, which is a huge number of people. And
especially if then they go on to Twitter and Facebook and all those places and say, oh my God.
Exactly. And so they sort of calculated this was costing them like 10 million pounds of revenue a year or something like that. That was probably conservative, because to your point, somebody goes on Twitter and all of a sudden that one person becomes 1,000. But, you know, there's an economic reason to treat people the right way if you need it. But hopefully the reason enough is just that, have some empathy and remember when you were in that situation. And so, you know, to sort of close the loop on this, like, there's the system, and then you got to use the system appropriately. And even some of the largest companies that have people dedicated to this, like, they're not sending people, they're not closing the loop on candidates. They're not being like, hey, we rejected you, and like, here are some resources if you're still looking for a job, or whatever the case may be. They're just like driving people insane with no answer, with the ghost, you know?
Well, and that is probably one of the hardest things to say, we didn't love you. You know, and because, you know, more than likely then somebody comes back and says, why not? You know,
and there's legal implications too. There's a compliance thing. Somebody's a protected class. You're opening yourself up to lawsuits.
Oh yeah. I mean, you have to be so careful. You know, you can't say, gee, you know, I didn't hire you because you're over 65. You know?
Yeah, over 40. Yeah.
You know,
so it is challenging. And also it's easy to avoid that email, right? Like, nobody wants to be like, hey, we're not hiring you. And they definitely don't want to tell you why, because it just seems like you're being a jerk. But if done in the right way, like, some companies do it in the right way, and that's amazing, you know, and those are the best in class companies.
Right. Well, and in many cases, they can't exactly tell you why, because it could be a reason that they can't disclose. You know, it could be that they thought, okay, you know, this person is too old, or, oh my gosh, we saw something on Facebook with them that we don't want to get anywhere near. Or, you know, all sorts of things. You know, it could be that they don't have the, you know, the correct education level. I mean, all sorts of things like that, yeah, you cannot say. So, they fall back on there was a better candidate. You weren't quite the right fit, all of those things. But at least hearing something is better than nothing, because until you hear you're not hired, you've got that little nugget of hope.
Yeah, and it just sort of, it takes up headspace where you could be going off and doing other things.
Right.
And so, and it's also, it's just viewed as being very rude, right? It's a common
Right.
courtesy. And, I think recruiting, like sales, is actually a lot like dating. And, there's all this like sort of like ghosting behavior on online dating. There's been many articles written about it, how it sort of drives people crazy. And it's the same exact dynamic. And so I think HR teams, even within their amazingly busy schedules that are about to get more busy, especially as, they're viewed as more or less cost centers and so are always under resourced, they have to put in the extra effort because it's people, it's people's lives that are sort of on the line.
Right. And of course it's the people who don't do this full time as their jobs, who need companies like yours, because they don't know, we don't know what we don't know. As we're coming out of the pandemic, whether we're still in it or not at this point in time when this airs, we're going to be staffing up and staffing down. It's just the way it's going to be, and there's going to be so many changes that are coming about because of this, that, especially say you're a small company where you've got 10 employees, you don't have an HR person. You are the owner and the HR person and, the chief bottle washer and all of those things. So to have a resource like yours to go through and go, okay, well, now what the heck do I do, is going to be invaluable.
Yeah, that's what we hope. And, we see it. There's basically two ways that I sort of get feedback on what we're doing. One is through looking at Google Analytics, and we can see, people spend.
What are people looking at?
Yeah, what are they looking at? How long are they spending on the site? Stuff like that. And then the other amazing thing, and it doesn't happen as much as maybe it should, and we need to allow people to do this, but people will give us a shout out on social, or they'll send us a note. And it's just really amazing because we're trying to help people to avoid a lot of the software costs $100,000 or $1 million a year. And if you're a larger company, a smaller company, it's 10 grand, but it's still the same. It's still a lot of money for you. And so we're helping people sort of like circumvent making bad decisions there, and hopefully utilizing it in the best way possible as well. And so that means a lot to us, and also the implication for what it means for the employees' lives as well.
Right. And as we've mentioned, we're doing this, we're recording this as we are in lockdown. As we've been quarantined, as many companies have been told you need to work from home, which from an HR landscape has completely and totally changed things. You have people who have never worked from home, and so what the heck do you do with those people? Do they even have the right resources to work from home? Then you have the people who are told, no, you still have to come in, but their kids are home, and so what do you do with those? And so I would imagine that you've been really busy.
Yeah. Been busy from a couple different perspectives. One is trying to help people understand how do we do this right? Like, how do we have a distributed workforce? What are the tools and technologies we can use? And beyond that, what are sort of the underlying philosophies? I sat down with this woman, Becca, and I'm going to butcher her last name.
I've got her blog post open right here in front of me.
Oh, all right. So Becca, who runs people operations at Help Scout, which is this company that has scaled from, I think, like 10 people to 100 over the last couple of years as she's been leading HR, and it's a fully remote team. And we had originally talked like a year and a half ago, and she's just really smart and has thought a lot about how do we create a great culture for a distributed workforce across the globe. And so we kind of reconnected a week or two ago, and we wrote up all those best practices on our blog. And I think, there's tools, there's tactics, et cetera. But I think the interesting sort of underlying philosophy is that the best practices for running a distributed team are the same exact best practices for a co-located office. It's just that it takes a little bit more intention and effort because you're not face to face, you're not having all that visual communication, the ad hoc communication. And so when you send somebody an email, you got to like put an emoji in that email. And when you are away from Slack and you're not going to respond, you've got to make sure that people know when you are going to be away and when you will respond, because otherwise there can be a lot of sort of strife. There's also, it has to be more intention about team building and making sure people get together in sort of like non-work settings, quote unquote, right? Like mostly over Zoom and these sort of virtual coffee chats. And so I think that's one of the most interesting sort of learnings for me is there's lots of tools and tactics. There's lots of great companies that have written up their full playbook, but really it's that underlying philosophy that drives the whole thing. And if you have that, you can sort of manage the corner cases that you are bound to run into on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been talking with my friends about this situation, and many of us have said, that remote work, working from home, even after all of this is done, is probably going to increase. There's going to be a lot of companies who are going to go, well, we might not need this 10,000 square foot office. As long as we're providing equipment for people to be home, not expecting them to have laptops, all those various things, if we're providing it, and we have the ability to either have them come together remotely, say on Zoom, or, we've got a conference room, all those various things. We're thinking that more and more companies are going to decide, work from home, work remotely situations might be a better way to go.
Yeah. And I think I'm a bit of a contrarian on this, and potentially because I like to be a contrarian in general, but I think what might actually happen is it sets work from home back a little bit, because if you think about it, all these people are all of a sudden working from home, but there was no infrastructure. There was no guidebook.
Because it was you're working from home tomorrow.
Exactly. There's no child care plan. And all of a sudden, most people's child care plan, school, is out, right?
Yeah. So, kid is now right there next to him.
Exactly. And so I think that probably there's going to be a lot of miscommunication. There's going to be a lot of strife. There's going to be a lot of sort of like negativity in the brains of the people that eventually make this decision going forward when we can all go back to work. And also what you're seeing when I talk to people that run companies is that people are not as productive right now at home. And I think that's interesting because, look, I work from home 90% of the time. We have an office. I just don't go into it because I can be 3x more productive at home, and I can also enjoy it more, right? Like I can go do yoga at 12 o'clock in the afternoon. I can, get up.
You can do interviews.
I can do interviews. I can do all this stuff. I can work for 3 hours straight uninterrupted. And if you do that, it's like, working like a week, basically. Like that's how much work you get done. And so for me, like I love working from home, but if I had never done it before and tomorrow someone's like, hey, Phil, you're going to work from home, you get 2 small kids at home, like I wouldn't get anything done. And I think that's happening to a lot of people. A lot of people also are stressed out because of everything that's happening. They're watching their stock portfolio. They're looking at the news.
What do they say? It's a 101k now.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. It's kind of crazy. And there's probably a lot more strife to come. So I think that's also contributing to a lack of productivity. And if that is sort of the trend and it's not course corrected over the next couple of months, when we all come back, I think a lot of people are just going to think work from home is bad. Like that's all I remember is like it's a disaster. And we don't want to go back to that. So that's my sort of contrarian view of all of this. And maybe I'm wrong.
Well, and I think a big part of it was the fact that it was immediate. Nobody had really any notice. And, and having kids at home for many people, or if not, a kid, a spouse, all of these various things, we didn't know what to do, and of course the big thing was there was not time for communication. So there wasn't time to tell people, okay, we're still going to require that you are at your computer from X time to X time. And of course, part of the thing is now people are more flexible. They're figuring out, well, hey, I can get a lot more work done between 9 p.m. and midnight. Kids are asleep. And I've talked about that with other guests on the program that, just working with people in general, we're having to figure things like that out. How do we communicate? Some people like text, some people like email messages, some people still got to pick up the phone. Mm-hmm. So, we're working through those things, but, I think and of course there are people and, companies and things like that where they are going to do better when they are in that office environment for whatever reason. They need that structure. They need that feedback. Depending on what you're doing, it's, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, those are great, but it's very different than talking to the person in the cubicle beside you, or being able to get up and walk in and run something past your boss. So I think it's going to be interesting when things have calmed down. And my assumption is it is going to take a while for things to calm down and for people to really figure out, okay, this is our new normal. But it'll be interesting to see what happens. But I think a big part of that is, there will be new rules. There's obviously going to have to be new HR rules, regulations. And I'm meaning that as in, a part-time worker may now be defined differently because they can work differently, or a full-time worker. And of course that's a state and that's federal, and all of those various things. So I think it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, I do too. And actually, as I warned you, I'm going to put my standing desk down here.
I know. See, that's the thing. We work from home, and so we have standing desks, and we have work. We have seated desks. And I was sharing with you that I have a standing desk that I never use.
Right.
And of course we have those things in our if we have a physical office that we're going to, but that can also be something that if somebody works from home. We've talked about, are you going to provide a computer for them? Probably. I mean, if you need them to be on a computer, you darn well better provide them with that. But, what about office equipment? A desk, a printer, Wi-Fi. That's been one of the things that I have heard people complain about is they said, this is great. We thought we had really good technology until we had 3 kids and 2 adults on our Wi-Fi all the time. And, and just not having the right equipment. They didn't have desks, or they had a home office, but it really wasn't set up to be functioning like that. So, that's going to be something that companies are going, if they decide, hey, it is going to work to have people working from home, they're going to have to come to those decisions and then be lost as to what the heck do they do, and so that's where companies like yours comes in, because, you're able to go through and the software, is going to say, okay, you need to provide X number of dollars of equipment so that it's fair, and then all of these various things. So I think it's probably, it's going to be very interesting for you the next probably year or so as things shake down.
Yeah, I think our business has changed a lot in the last month and a half. Mm-hmm. And we're very fortunate in that, like, certain parts of it have gotten decimated and certain parts of it have grown tremendously. And it, wasn't planned at all. Obviously, right. All of this stuff is pure luck at this point. Nobody saw this thing coming. But there are a lot of changes, and, it really depends on your organization, what sort of budget you have, how much is a productive employee worth to you?
Right.
And therefore, how much are you willing to give out in budget? A couple of friends of mine are already at this point, and we're kind of recording this in early April, have basically said, like, look, my company gave me $1,000 to, like, set up a home office. And those are people that make a couple $100,000 a year. Right. And they're, the value to the company is probably 4 or 5x what they get paid. And so it makes total sense. Like, whatever we can do to, like, make you happy, let's just do that. Right.
And we don't want you determining at this point in time there's something else you could be doing.
Right, exactly. Or struggling, being 10% less productive because like you're
Right.
walking
Yeah. 10% can cost companies millions in some cases.
easily. Yeah, without a doubt. What's interesting, just, going back to this Becca at Help Scout, what they do is they give everybody a stipend. So they
Ah.
give, I think it's like $500 a month,
Hmm. Hmm.
and you can use it to get like a WeWork
Oh.
subscription in your local city. You can
Hmm.
use it to
Hmm.
set up your home office, like whatever you want to do with it.
Hmm.
And actually, a pretty small percentage of people actually use the money.
Hmm.
Um, so what they do is they take all of the extra money at the end of the year
Hmm.
and they throw a huge party. They fly
Oh.
everybody in.
Oh,
They
I
do it
like
in
that.
like
Hmm.
amazing international
Hmm.
locations because their team is all over the
Hmm.
place. And so you can imagine a world where, and look, money's going to be tight over
Hmm.
the at least the short term, hopefully
Right.
not the long term. But you could imagine a system where you're sort of like making the right incentives so that
Hmm.
somebody's not just going to go buy like a PlayStation with
Hmm.
this stipend.
Right. Hmm. Yeah. We
um,
need receipts.
we need receipts. Yeah, we need receipts first of all,
Hmm.
and second of all, like maybe there's a certain amount of budget for a team of 10 people
Hmm.
and everybody sort of it's sort of like that village, like holding themselves
Hmm.
accountable, that
Hmm.
microfinance sort of dynamic. And you're using the extra money to do something cool
Hmm.
when everybody can go meet up again.
Right.
So yeah, it's a constantly evolving landscape.
Hmm.
Even something so simple like your I-9 form when you
Hmm.
start a new job
Right.
usually has to be
Hmm.
done in person. And so I've seen like, I don't know, 30 HR people post on social media in the last 2 weeks, like, hey, how do we do these virtually?
Hmm.
How do we get them notarized,
Right.
etc.
Yeah.
And so even
When is an e-signature not enough?
right,
Hmm.
exactly. Yeah. And so all these little things, like it's just an evolving world that we haven't figured it out yet,
Hmm.
but it's sort of an interesting fire drill that I think will lead to a lot of
Hmm.
innovation and
Right.
probably changes in the way that we
Hmm.
work for the better.
Hmm. Right. And one of the things that had started before this, that now I think is probably really going to expand a lot, is having people in different states and more importantly different countries, and so you're hiring an entire team of customer service people,
Mhm.
I mean that's easy to kind of joke about, that are in a different country, let's be honest, there are a lot of positives to doing something like that. We joke about, oh my gosh, you get the customer service person who doesn't speak English, but you also can get customer service people who are phenomenal and are in other countries, or even other states, and depending on your type of business, having people that are 24/7 type of workers, all of those various things. And that again is something that's very confusing for people. What type of benefits do you even have to provide benefits? And somebody like me is going, oh, okay. And so knowing that there's resources out there like yours is just incredible.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things that's going to change sort of the future of work for
Hmm.
the better. You saw within the technology community probably like 7 or 8 years ago, a
Hmm.
lot of
Hmm.
companies in Silicon Valley and Boston and New York were just like, man, we're spending so much money on talent. It's crazy,
Hmm.
right? And so they started going to Denver and
Hmm.
Austin, and
Right.
they really
Hmm.
transformed a lot of these
Hmm.
cities. And now you're seeing a new generation of companies that are basically starting off as remote. And this is
Hmm.
for anybody in the organization, right? It's anybody from customer service,
Hmm.
entry level person, all the way through the director of product
Right.
management. And they've figured out the ways for people
Hmm.
to work asynchronously across the
Hmm.
globe, which, if you live in a place where you traditionally had very full employment, and maybe this is a competitor to you having a
Hmm.
job, but realistically, I think the economy, once it gets humming again, is going to go back to that, like,
Right.
3%
Hmm.
unemployment where people are
Hmm.
fighting over talent and there's
Right.
inflation and there's all these sorts of
Hmm.
risks. And so I think for the most part, that's a great thing. And
Hmm.
again, it comes down to then, what are the tools? How do we
Hmm.
manage? This sounds so stupid, but like international background checks,
Right.
right? Most
Oh yeah.
background
And
checks,
and do you even have to? I mean,
right? What's
Mhm.
the legal implication for it? What are the ethical
Mhm.
implications? If let's say, I don't know, you hire somebody who lives in Amsterdam, where a lot of drugs are legal, right? Like, do you
Right.
run a drug screen on that person? Like,
Mm-hmm.
there's all sorts of like
Mm-hmm.
things. And so again, it's like the tools, and then like,
Mm-hmm.
how do you actually implement the tools, and,
Mm-hmm.
and what's the philosophy
Right.
behind that implementation?
Mm-hmm.
That's really, really important. That we're trying to get the best
Mm-hmm.
nuggets from the smartest people around the
Right.
world and aggregate them into these guides.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's funny you mentioned companies that are setting up remote locations. Years ago, I worked for a company in Denver, and we moved our call center to Minot, North Dakota.
Okay.
And people are like, "Oh my gosh, why Minot?" Well, for several reasons. First of all, cost of living was much less there. More importantly, there's a military base there.
Mm.
And so there were people who were there for several years who wanted to work. And it was perfect because, yeah, again, it was less expensive, but these were people who had college degrees, who they were the spouses of someone who was stationed there, and support services, things like that. And it was perfect. I mean, it was and that, I think, is what we see is when companies are setting up a remote location. It's not that they're, yes, there are times where they are obviously going outside the United States, but there are also times where they're thinking, hey, you know what, this might be good here.
Yeah, without a doubt. And there are so many specialized talent profiles out there now that are essential to different types of companies, where there just aren't enough people in a given country to
Right.
satisfy the
Mm-hmm.
demands.
Mm-hmm.
And you're seeing, obviously there's a lot of controversy about like the H-1B visa program, and sort of like revamping that, and whatever. And just sort of anecdotally, there's a lot of, friends of mine who are hiring for, some weird data scientist specialty or cybersecurity or whatever. And like, there's like 15 people in the US, they all make an insane
Right.
amount of money
Oh
because
yeah, because there's just 15 people.
exactly. And so it's like, hey, but there's this guy who lives in Budapest who does this, and
Right.
he's making 60K a year, like, do we
Yeah,
get this
and you're
guy
like,
visa?
whoa, he's a good guy.
Yeah, exactly. And so now, like, you don't need to uproot that person. Like, that person can join your team, and if you have the right tools, you have the right protocols, and you can work as if they were down the office, and with the same amount of productivity and
Right.
collegial,
Right.
collegiality, whatever the word is.
And again, it comes back to communication, where you tell them, okay, we know you're off in Timbuktu, but every Monday morning at 9 a.m. our time, we
Yeah.
have a meeting that
Yeah.
you need to participate in. Okay, that might be 3 a.m. for them or something like that. But if they know, okay, part of my job is that I have to be part of this meeting, then they're cool with it. And so it comes back to really communicating with the folks you've got. And the same thing within an office. You've got all these, you still have to tell people there, you know what, this 9 o'clock meeting is required. You might now be working from home 5 days a week, but you need to be in for that meeting once a month, or whatever it is.
Yeah. And a lot of this stuff can be done asynchronously as well, over, something like Slack,
Right.
where you might have traditionally a product team might have like a early morning stand up where everybody sort of like runs through like what they're doing.
Right.
Now you can do that just in a group chat, and maybe somebody does that 12 hours later than another person, but it's all good as long as sort of that box is checked.
Right.
So
and you can do things now with recording things. So maybe it's a training session, and so you record it. Well, then there are ways now to track, okay, did X, person actually watch it? And I mean, we've been doing that for years, where we've had to, do online training and things like that. But now it's even more important, because, we do need to make sure that, okay, well, we had this new employee orientation, and did all of the people participate for the full hour? And of course, we're still having to take it on faith. because, unless somebody's looking at a camera and making sure that that person is sitting there for that full hour watching the training, we're still having to think, okay, Deb logged in at this point, she answered a question at this point, and she logged out at this point. So it seems like she was there. We're going to assume that it was Deb. I've been talking with people who are now having to have their kids at home. And I said, how in the heck do they handle tests and things like that? How do you know that, little Sue was the person who took that test?
Right.
And, and they said, well, there are some ways, obviously, but a lot of it does come down to faith and trusting people. And let's be honest, you have to do that in companies anyway. You're trusting that your employees aren't stealing from you, all these various things. And so that is part of the whole background check, all of those other things.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is something I've thought about a little bit, which is like, how do you sort of ensure that your employees are getting the work done? And I think there's like two sort of major philosophies with this. And one is this sort of paternalistic sort of, hey, we're going to install spyware on a computer and like
count your keystrokes.
Yeah, there's enough activity. And there was a big expose in Bloomberg about that a week or so ago about companies doing that. And I think that, creates a very toxic culture.
Oh yeah. I wouldn't want to work there. I mean, even doing the work and it'd be like, oh, they clearly don't trust me.
Yeah. And it's just gonna, like, I'm a big believer in culture is actually pretty important for productivity and obviously for happiness and things like that. But, and the other is just like, hey, can you create a culture where people can celebrate the wins, where everybody's sort of proud of the work that they're doing, where there is some sort of like somewhat auditable trail of like, hey, you're supposed to do X, Y, Z, and you're actually doing it sort of thing. And I think one of the things that might come out of this is, the sort of focus on output versus hours might become really important because at the end of the day, like, you might all of a sudden think, wow, that person who's always here and always, cheerful and blah, blah, they actually don't do anything.
Right. Oh yeah. Yeah. And they're the office busybody.
Exactly. Yeah. And they actually never get anything done, right? Like, they're very good at playing the politics game. Right. They're good at kind of sucking up, but at the end of the day, like, they're not really doing their job, and maybe vice versa, right? There's that person who's sort of the curmudgeon who is more quiet and introverted, but it's like, whoa, like when you don't see the person and you just see the work, you are so much more appreciative of that person. And then it's like, okay, like, why, like, what are they doing that's so effective? Like, why are they, and when you just look at the numbers, it sort of just gives you this different lens that potentially lets you see things more objectively.
Right. Yeah, because you have people that, you've got task A, they can do it in 4 hours, and somebody else it takes 6, and somebody else it might take 10. Then you need to decide, okay, is that acceptable? And is it more important that the job gets done, or are we counting hours? And that truly is an HR thing, because that could change somebody's part-time, full-time status, all sorts of things like that. And so that's where this is a challenge. But I love it because we are, pandemic aside, we are taking more and more into account actual people. I mentioned, how do they communicate? Do they like texting? Do they like emailing? Do they like, all these various things? Are they really more productive at night as opposed to in the morning?
Yeah.
It comes back to, does the job get done? And that's the important thing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it also probably will give insights into individual workers that perhaps realize the value that they can bring an organization, the value that they can capture from the value that they're bringing is much greater than they previously thought. Got a couple friends who in the last couple years have sort of gone off and done their own mini consulting firms because they just realized that, the work that I do in 20 hours is the work that my colleagues do in 50 or 60 hours. Right. And if I can charge by the hour, or I can charge per project, and I can charge at the same rate that they're paying the internal folks, I can make a lot more money. And so there's, some friends of mine who do these consulting projects, and they're their effective hourly rate
Mm-hmm.
is $400 or $500 an hour.
Right.
And it's because they're basically like, hey, I'll do this project and I'll
Mm-hmm.
charge you $30,000 for it. And the company says, wow, that's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
How could you ever do this for 30 grand? We would have to have two people work on
Mm-hmm.
this for 6 months and it would cost us,
Mm-hmm.
80 grand or whatever. And they're like, hey, yeah, don't worry about it. And they're just
Mm-hmm.
super effective. And
Mm-hmm.
so they can basically capture that economic value in a better way. And I think there's probably going to be a lot of people that
Mm-hmm.
realize that they have some more worth,
Right.
and sort of start to rethink their career paths.
Right. One of the things you mentioned are some of the other legal things that people have to deal with, especially when we are dealing with people in different states. You mentioned, drug testing. I'm from Colorado. Now I don't live there now, but I do keep tabs on things, and medical marijuana and recreational marijuana is clearly something that is going to be a hot button for several years to come. And a one person shop like me, or you don't have very many places, that's very difficult to keep track of. I have a family member who works on a Native American reservation where they don't allow any type of drug use, and and so they'll fail the tests, and they're told, well, we're sorry, and they're like, but we live in X state, and they said, no, that where you work is different, and so knowing all of that, that's where, as we were saying, software, like the companies that you work with is invaluable, because we don't know these things. We can't keep track of these things. Some of them are changing, yearly as legislative sessions go in and out. And then of course you toss in federal laws, and we can't keep up. We have to rely on software. And, you mentioned 400. I mean, I can't keep track of what I'm supposed to be doing, let alone try to figure out all the software that could be tracking it. But just knowing it's out there, that's an invaluable resource.
Yeah. I mean, the background check, which is such like a teeny tiny part of any employee life cycle, right? Is an enormously complex thing that is always changing what you have to do for certain roles.
Right.
You think about truck drivers or whatever, what you can't do for others, what maybe you shouldn't do. It's really, really complicated. And that's why it makes sense to do the work to figure out who's a vendor we can partner with, who's going to help basically outsource this stuff, because we don't have time to go and do all this stuff. You think about benefits, like, what benefits should we be offering to who?
Right.
How much?
What benefits do we have to offer?
What do we have to offer? How do we negotiate for stuff like that? What should we be paying? Like that's several full-time employees. And if even if you've got a 500 person company, you're not going to want to devote the resources. That's crazy. And so you need to go find a benefits provider. And it's like, all right, well, there's 700 of them in the United States. Which of these do I actually want to look at? That could take somebody 6 months to a year just to do it the right way. And that's why, we're basically doing the 6 months to a year research and hopefully helping people circumvent that and make the right decision faster.
Right. And again, what you do is you help people try and figure all this stuff out, because there is just so much. And it's like I was saying at the very start of the program, I had no clue. I really had no clue. And now I know that I don't want to be an HR person. I don't want, because it is very complicated. But it's something that is extremely complicated. And if that's, whether it's your full-time job, that's all you do for a company, or if you just have to handle it, on an as needed basis, it can get extremely overwhelming.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I also, for the record, would not want to be an HR person. It's just a hard job. And most companies do not appreciate their HR team.
No.
It's like, what are the fewest amount of employees that we can have in HR and still do the job, because it's a cost center, right? It's not driving us revenue. It's not building a product, which is sort of like a very old world way of thinking about it. And there are companies
because
like,
if you don't hire the right people, nothing's really going to get done. So your HR people are absolutely critical.
right. And you keep them happy, you retain them, you get them to refer their friends. Like the difference between a good HR team and an excellent one that you might find at like McKinsey or Google or Goldman Sachs is a massive world of difference. And there's a reason why those best companies, like I don't think anybody would disagree that Google is one of the best run companies in the world. There's a reason that from the get-go, these folks were investing heavily into human resources and people.
Right. And then the HR people are considered to be a critical, as we've been saying, a critical portion. When I worked in corporate America, the HR people, the whole department bounced from who they reported to. And sometimes, as I was the head of corporate communications, sometimes I reported to HR, sometimes I didn't. I mean, it was one of these weird things where we never knew. It was really funny when we actually were laying people off. We didn't know who should sign my paperwork because we didn't know who I reported to. I'm the head of corporate communications, but nobody knew. So we ended up just going up to the CEO and he signed off on it. But yeah, it's one of those things that is absolutely critical that is too often an afterthought.
Yeah, unfortunately, and that impacts employees' lives, and I think the thing that people should really pay attention to is it impacts the business in a huge way. There's like some very simple math that you retain people slightly longer, you get them to refer slightly more employees, you get them in the door slightly faster, ramped up slightly faster. Like if you do these things like a little bit better, it results in massive revenue increases and profit savings, et cetera. And if you do a really good job, then you're going to see outsized returns. And that's why, sometimes you're seeing like really, really senior, amazing business leaders who are transitioning into these like chief people officer, CHRO type roles, because a couple, some small percentage of companies, and it's probably less than 5%, are realizing how important that function is within the rest of the organization.
Right. And I'm going to make a big assumption here. I could be completely wrong, but I think as we come out of the pandemic, people are really going to realize just how important a lot of this is, because there will be employees that they're going to think, nah, we really don't need them anymore. But more importantly, they're really going to have to ramp back up. They've had to furlough quite a few people, whether they wanted to or not, they had to. I mean, this was just, they had to furlough. So now what do? Do you automatically bring people back, or do they have to go through the whole process again? And so I can just tell right now, every HR person in the United States is going, they're thinking this is going to be quite the challenge, and so they'll be coming to companies like yours. So tell us a little bit again more about what it is that you do and how you work with companies.
Yeah, so we just do a ton of research at Select Software Reviews about who are the best vendors in a given category of HR software. How do you buy the software? What questions should you ask on demos? How do you think about return on investment, budgeting, pricing, all that stuff? How do you negotiate contracts? And then after you actually implement it, like how do you implement it correctly, and what are the best practices for using it in an effective manner? And so we do all this research and we put it together into actionable guides that are pretty easy to digest. It's video, it's spreadsheets, it's text, and it's all for free. So it's just out there on the internet. We have an advertising model where we make enough money to sort of keep the lights on. And so we just want to be sort of a great trusted resource for the HR and recruiting teams out there who are trying to figure this stuff out and don't have a dedicated procurement person who's just going to help them run a massive RFP on what applicant tracking system to buy.
Right. And again, that's selectsoftwarereviews.com. But if people want to reach out to you and connect with you directly, how do they do that?
I think the best way to get in contact with me is on LinkedIn.
Okay.
There aren't too many Phil Strazzullas out there, so I'm pretty easy to find.
Perfect. I love it. Well, this really has been very informative because, as I said, I know nothing about any of this. And so to me, it's fascinating. And to think, oh my gosh, there's so many resources out there, that can get overwhelming, and that's the big thing is it's not that you're picking between 5 different types of software. You're picking between hundreds of different types of software. And so of course the big thing is people just go, well, nah, we're not going to do it at all.
Yeah.
So that's where it's great to have a resource like your company to go to say, okay, this is our company. This is what we do. Now what? And to be able to do that. So Phil, do you have any final words of wisdom for everyone?
I think in general, the best thing to do is when you're looking at sort of HR software is just to sort of, and any of these sort of decisions is understand what are the assumptions I'm making here and what's the value at the end of the day. And if you can sort of map that out, maybe it's a spreadsheet model, maybe it's just sort of a document. And this is how I make a lot of decisions in my life. Like you're just going to have a better outcome. And then what's really cool is if you actually document it 6, 12, 18 months later, you can go back and you can look at, why did I make this decision? What was I right about? What was I wrong about? And that will continue to evolve your ability to make decisions, whether it's about, HR software, a job to take, where to move, whatever the case may be.
Right. I love it. I love it. Well, again, you can find information on Phil's company at selectsoftwarereviews.com. I'm Deb Creer. I've been having a fascinating discussion with Phil Strazzulla. And until next time, everyone have a great day.
Tune in for our next program for even more trends, best practices, and techniques for how to make your business a success. The Business Power Hour, hosted by Deb Creer, is proud to be part of the C-Suite Network.